the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before I introduce our guest today, I do want to mention, if you're enjoying the content that I'm putting out, I do have a Patreon page at www.patreon.com/MUHH. My goal is to have an additional 60 patrons before the end of the year. I just want to at least get to the point where my expenses are, I'm not losing money producing the podcast, but no matter what, I'm going to continue to do it. A very machinic welcome to today's guest, Dr. Lewis Call, professor in the Department of History at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and author of 3 books, Postmodern Anarchism, which we'll be discussing a lot today, BDSM in American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and Sexualities in the Works of Joss Whedon, as well as a number of different articles published in various journals. And there is one we'll actually discuss about the comic book, The Invisibles by Grant Morrison. But Lewis, thanks so much for joining me today on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
Well, thanks for having me, Cooper. Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. Tremendous pleasure. Like we kind of were talking before we hit record. Lewis is the final collection in my postmodern anarchist collection of thinkers, in addition to Saul Newman, Todd May, Andrew Koch. So you're completing, what is it? My Infinity Gauntlet of those thinkers is completed now. So
that's right.
Out.
So pretty soon you'll be ready to rule the universe.
That's exactly. Snap my fingers. Get any guests that I want. If you turn me down, exactly. If you turn me down, I snap. You're gone. You're out of here.
That's it.
To sort of ease into the conversation today, what I just kind of wanted to get a feel for, like I mentioned, I've been getting back into reading comics over the past 5 or 6 years. It's something that I've enjoyed tremendously, just in terms of getting the kind of creative juices flowing. I missed out on a lot of the kind of more adult comics that had been written and published over the years. So I'm lucky in a way that I'm getting back to go back and read all these, kind of masterpieces of comics. But I'm curious, so were you someone that read comics as growing up, or kind of where was that? How did you get into that or decide to write about that topic?
So I've always loved comics. I've read comics ever since I was a kid. I collect them. My garage is just literally full of boxes and boxes and boxes of comic books. So it's a little bit of an obsession, I guess. But so with comics, I've done something that I try to do with a lot of things, which is to take one of my weird obsessions and then turn it into an object of scholarly study. So it's one of the really fun things that happens when you go into a research field like science fiction and fantasy. You realize, all this crazy stuff that I've always loved ever since I was a kid, I can actually write papers about it. I can write books about it. I can go to conferences about it. Well, I used to before COVID, go to conferences about it. So it's a lifelong love of mine.
I love looking at, I think, particularly like the postmodern, post-structuralist theory is so good at being able to like kind of a tool for analyzing text and whatnot. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that. So my big hobby horse now is this relationship between the theory and posting and memes online. Mm-hmm. Particularly, like I see this kind of merging, or have this idea of kind of merging Lacan and Baudrillard in this study of, I think Twitter in particular is the one that I find the most interesting. And I think we'll get into that a bit later on in the conversation. But since you mentioned taking those kind of, these funny little hobbies that you've had or things that you love that you can kind of twist to fit theory is always fun.
This will be the first of probably several times when I reveal that I'm actually pretty old. So I came up with the original definition of the term meme, right, which comes from the work of Richard Dawkins. And it's, he understood it as a self-propagating piece of information. So he was using it as a way to understand genetics and so forth.
Right.
I've learned from my kids that it now has a very different meaning. And it's related, obviously. But
Right.
so now, when people say meme, they mean one of these catchy little pictures that has a phrase that goes along with it that circulates rapidly on the internet. And, it's pretty interesting to see how the younger generation has kind of appropriated that concept of the meme and, figured out how to use that, I think, pretty effectively.
I agree.
So it's, for an era where, people's attention spans are maybe not that long, it seems like a, pretty sort of quick, pithy way that you can get an idea out there into the popular consciousness. So, yeah, it's been interesting.
Exactly. It's interesting to see, I think, just semiotically kind of how those things function. And you see like the repetition of it and like the evolution of it. It's so fast. Mm-hmm. These things get, you know what I mean? And then it becomes a reference of it kind of spirals on and on and on. I think Baudrillard would probably love to see what's going on today.
Oh, yeah. Multiple orders of simulation going on with a meme. So, the meme perhaps comments on some kind of social or cultural phenomenon. And then there's another meme that comments on the first meme, right?
Right.
So you get this kind of self-referential thing going on. And it is related to comic books, which you were mentioning a moment ago, because, here you have a pretty effective way to combine text with image to generate something
true,
which,
yeah.
It ends up being, I think, more than the sum of its parts, right? It has more of an impact than the picture by itself would or the text by itself would.
Absolutely. Just to maybe back up before we get too in depth here, I'm just kind of curious, would you share maybe some of your all-time favorite comics or some that you found to be, you've enjoyed the most or you would recommend to someone who has an interest but hasn't really, delved into the history of comics that seriously?
For people who are interested in the more political comics, I guess Alan Moore and David Lloyd's V for Vendetta would be one obvious place to start. So that one's had a huge impact within the world of comics, but also I think more broadly in popular culture, just as a way to express some fairly radical revolutionary ideas, but in an accessible fashion.
Right.
Which to me is really one of the strengths of the comic book form. Right, they're able to take some often pretty sophisticated theoretical concepts and put them out there in a way that that will be accessible to the average comic book reader. So that's a good one. Let's see. I mean, I like, I like some kind of mainstream superhero comics too, although I tend to like the less mainstream versions of those mainstream comics.
Right.
So for example, you mentioned Grant Morrison. He's recently been doing a Green Lantern series that's pretty interesting. And I feel like, Morrison's really in his element when he's doing science fiction,
Right.
because he's just, he's one of the best people in terms of being able to just imagine a truly alien world or an environment that is truly other, right? And so much of the second-rate science fiction is just, they take something from Earth and they just put it in space, right, and call it science fiction. So, with Morrison, I feel like you get something that's much more creative and seems authentically different. So I like his stuff.
His Doom Patrol run is one of my all-time favorites. I liked that. I mean, we're going to discuss a little bit from your article on the Invisibles, but Doom Patrol is my favorite Morrison that I've read so far.
Yeah, Doom Patrol is a trip, man. Definitely Grant Morrison's, and then after him, Gerard Way kind of took up the baton and sort of pushed the envelope maybe even a little bit further than Grant Morrison had. And that's really saying something, right? So, and then I've recently been enjoying the TV show.
Yes.
So they've made a TV version, which seems to me pretty strongly inspired by both the Grant Morrison and the Gerard Way Doom Patrol comics, I would say.
Agreed. I was about to ask you that because I also watched the show, and one of my favorite, I love how and this kind of maybe is a good segue for us, is I love the way that they did the Danny the Street episode was just absolutely brilliant. That was so good. I was so pleased with that. And just to give, I guess, listeners background, so Danny the Street is a sentient piece of, I guess, what would you say? He's like a sort of a main street, but little sort of section. Like that's the entity. And let's see, at least starting out, he was, maybe I'm even misgendering. So Danny the Street was somewhat of a.
I think Danny's non-binary, right?
Right. Yeah, I know, right? So should back up. They are rather, or at least started out as a cross-dresser, which I don't know if that seems maybe like that's an older terminology. I don't know if that's what the terminology even.
Yeah, I think that probably is a little bit dated, and that one probably comes from Morrison because he was writing about this stuff actually before a lot of other people were, because he also writes about it in The Invisibles as well, and that was back in the 90s.
Absolutely.
And so he uses terms like cross-dressing or transvestism, which are not used so much anymore, but I think were probably appropriate at the time.
Right. I have always been thoroughly impressed with Morrison doing that at that, early 90s is pretty early on. So I've always thought that was pretty incredible of him to be exploring those avenues that like now, 20 years later, that's,
everybody does. Yeah, but he did it before it was cool, right?
Exactly. Moving forward into kind of the discussion of, so you wrote an article about the Invisibles recently. So this was published in 2018, A Thought Thinking Itself, Post-Anarchism, and Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. So we'll start off discussing that. So we already discussed that. I read the first 3 volumes of the trade paperbacks that have been published. I think the whole series out, of course. So I don't have as much knowledge of probably, I guess, the second half. And so just as a warning too, we may spoil a bit of the ending of the series today. So spoiler alert to anybody's listening. But I thought you made some really interesting points here about comics operating in the Lacanian imaginary and symbolic. Can you maybe unpack that for us? And maybe in the context of The Invisible specifically.
It actually gets back to what we were talking about a minute ago, that, comics are this really unique medium because they're able to combine words and pictures in this really innovative fashion. And so it occurred to me some time ago that an interesting way to approach this might be to take Jacques Lacan's theory that human experience is basically divided up into these 3 different realms. So there's the real, which we can't say anything about. It's inaccessible. It's this, Lacan calls it this traumatic kernel at the heart of our experience. Then there's the imaginary, which is the realm of feeling and emotion and also visuals, right? The realm of image.
Image, right?
Yeah. And then there's the symbolic, what Lacan calls the symbolic. And this is the realm of language and culture, philosophy and thought and all of those sorts of things. And so, it just occurred to me that comics operate at this kind of interesting intersection between the imaginary and the symbolic, right? Because obviously they have a textual element, but I feel like it's one of the few media where the visual element is at least as significant as the textual element. And especially once you start to look at some of the formal aspects of comics, things like page layout, panel composition, all of the technical parts. There's so much that goes into it that a comic book artist is putting into it that, the average comic book reader might never think about that, but it really has a powerful impact on the meaning of the comic and on the way that it expresses its ideas. And so, I thought it would be kind of fun to just play around a little bit with that. And it seemed like Morrison's Invisibles would be a good vehicle for that because, he's one of these authors who likes to break the fourth wall, as they say, and actually, comment on some of the things that he's doing in his comics. So, there are some things in the Invisibles comics that, I think really speak pretty directly to the relationship between symbolic and imaginary and some other aspects of semiotic theory. For example, he made up this fictional hallucinogenic drug called the key drug. And so what it does is when a person takes it, they lose the distinction between a word and the object that word names, right? So it's really clever. So in structuralist or post-structuralist terms, it basically causes the signifier and the signified to collapse into one another. And then the characters are taking this in the comics from time to time. So it just seemed like, Morrison's thinking about these things. The comic is also expressing these things to the audience. So, it seemed like a good way to explore some of those ideas.
And then even overtly, there's Anarchist References. I recently reread the first volume again, and there's a Kropotkin reference. There's a couple of different things sprinkled throughout at least that first volume, and I'm sure I'd have to read again the rest of the series. I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, it's very eclectic. There's lots of situationism. The Marquis de Sade appears as a character in there,
yeah.
and I mean, he's obviously problematic in some ways, but also a revolutionary figure who participated in the radical phase of the French Revolution and talks about some of those ideas in the comics. So there's quite a few points in the narrative at which it connects to real world politics and philosophy.
You refer to the Invisibles as a post-anarchist cultural artifact, which I think is interesting. I don't think most people conceive of comics that way, but can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
So I guess this is the part of comic book studies that can be a little bit frustrating, is that oftentimes if you're a scholar who studies comic books, you spend a whole lot of time just justifying your field, right? And just explaining why this is actually a legitimate scholarly enterprise and why people should actually care. Because, it's even today, it's still quite easy for somebody to just dismiss comic books and say they're for kids, they don't matter, they're irrelevant. Now, the good news is that I think that's much less true than it used to be, because there's a number of people who've been doing really serious work on comics for decades now. And so I think it has made its way more into the kind of academic mainstream. But having said all that, it's still, I think, pretty easy for people to take this kind of dismissive attitude towards comics. So when I describe something like The Invisibles as a cultural artifact, it's partly meant to kind of challenge that attitude, right? To suggest that, hey, this is, an interesting object which our culture produced, and we should take it seriously, and we should examine it the same way we might examine, a great painting or a sculpture or a symphony or anything like that, right? It's not fundamentally different from those other things. It's just that it's a medium that doesn't have the same kind of cultural capital behind it that some of those, quote unquote, high art media might have.
That's what I love about the meme too. And in my own, so I'm a pretty prolific poster on Twitter. I have an anonymous account that's it's a half joke account, but half serious. And what my favorite thing to do is kind of collapse that distinction between this sort of bawdy sense of humor with these kind of like high theory elements. And I find that endlessly fun. And I don't know, I just playing with tearing those signifiers apart, putting them back together, into some kind of an assemblage, if you will, is so much fun. And I don't know, I love that format. There's a jouissance to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so much fun. And I think that kind of ties into that. Really kind of the post-structuralists are very good about, collapsing that distinction between high and low culture. And I love mashing those things together so much.
Yeah, and there's a pretty strong theoretical tradition behind this. I mean, there's Levi-Strauss's concept of bricolage, right, where you take all these different bits and pieces of things and you put them together into something that's new and different and unique. There's the situationist strategy of détournement, right, where you take an existing cultural object and then you scrawl some graffiti on it, or you put like a comic book word balloon on top of it and just radically alter the meaning of it. So I think there's a lot to that. It's and I think it's a pretty powerful strategy for challenging the kind of fixed and established meanings that tend to cohere around cultural objects.
It's a lot of fun too. But I forgot to mention this, so you'll laugh at this. So it was really Morrison and Alan Moore that kind of got me into Spinoza, just based on their kind of approach towards ontology that I thought was interesting and funny. Like that's such a weird, way to get an interest in philosophy. But yeah, that was kind of really big for me in terms of getting into his work, which I think is a bit unexpected. But
I think that's one of the really cool things about Alan Moore is that, even though, He doesn't have very much in the way of formal education. He is such a smart guy and just so well read and just so, thoroughly well informed about such a huge variety of different political and philosophical issues. And he has these interviews where he says like, I've only ever read one book of theory. I think it was Roland Barthes. It's like the only book of theory that he ever read. And yet, without ever having read any of that stuff, he's managed to come to the same conclusions that a lot of these heavy theorists come to. And then even better, find a way to express these theories to, a pretty broad mainstream audience, which I just think is incredible.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of what I, in a way, largely go for here too, is to kind of bring down the high theory to the level of like, memes and things, and kind of show that so often, people are so intimidated by theory, but it helps you have a vocabulary to describe the feelings that you're already sort of having, or like things that you've noticed or thoughts that you've had, and it's just expressed in a different format, in a different vocabulary, etc. So that's sort of a mission of the podcast too, is to kind of eliminate that fear of high theory.
And I mean, this is one of the charges that is often leveled against post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-anarchism, all of the post things, right? Is that they're supposedly inaccessible. They're just these weird, ivory tower things. It's just a lot of jargon that a bunch of professors come up with, and that, regular people can't understand it. And I have to admit, I think there is it can be that, right? And there is sometimes an element of truth to that. Right. And so, one of the projects that I've been working on for a long time is to develop a less jargon heavy way of talking about these ideas, to develop a way of speaking about these things that people can actually read and can actually understand. Because I think it's a little too easy to just retreat into your jargon and just so you're having this conversation with like two other people and nobody else is paying attention. So that's what I hope to avoid.
I really did. The Postmodern Anarchism book was quite good. I really enjoyed it. It was sort of like eating cake a little bit for me. I love kind of
that's one of the nicest things that someone has said about my writing. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I mean, to kind of give you a bit of context on my own sort of development. So in grads, I guess, let's see. So I had an undergrad in English, so I got a little bit of exposure to Derrida, Foucault there. And that just got this has been like the last 20 years or so that I've been reading this stuff and thinking about it, and now started the podcast about 3 years ago now to kind of discuss and bring these ideas out and kind of make them more accessible. In grad school, it was reading Foucault in particular that kind of turned me into or made me start to think about anarchism. And so that's a legacy that pretty much continues, and I think it's grown much more and more sophisticated at that. And it was really funny too. Actually, I had written this paper about, and this was like 2008. So really, Facebook, Twitter, all the social media stuff was really in its infancy at that point, and was a totally different landscape than it is today. There was a lot more optimism that these would be great tools that would kind of be a democratizing force. Obviously, and I fell into that trap too. I was quite wrong in terms of how liberatory they would be, but I still think there's
a lot of us were
right. I still think there's a lot of value in those tools and ways to co-opt those into some sort of post-anarchist or anarchist practice to some degree, and inspired by the situationists and other sort of thinkers and movements. But it's funny, and I had written this paper about looking at, I think it was the Zapatista movement, the EZLN, and like Al-Qaeda, and how they were using communication networks to sort of, for coded messaging and all this sort of stuff. And I had cited Saul Newman in that paper, and I didn't even realize it until the other day. I was kind of going back and looking through the paper, and I looked through my citations, and there was Saul Newman, who I had totally forgotten that I had even cited him all those years ago.
Well, that's funny.
Right. That was an interesting little turn. And like I said, I didn't even realize until even after I had spoken with him. And Saul even said he's joined the there's a Stirner meme group on Facebook that
Oh
he
yeah,
just joined. So Saul Newman is on Stirner.
he's on board with the memes.
He
Okay,
is,
good,
yeah,
good.
absolutely right.
I think a lot of us were guilty of that kind of technological utopianism back in the day. It feels strange calling this back in the day, but
Right.
I mean, I was realizing, postmodern anarchism. I wrote that book almost 20 years ago now, and in terms of information technologies, that's like a lifetime, right? I mean, it was a totally different world back then. So, back then it was all new. It all seemed very innovative. We thought there was a lot of potential in terms of free speech, online organizing, helping social movements to develop in interesting ways. And that is still all possible, right? But I think, what we had underestimated back then was, and it seems foolish now, but
Right.
We underestimated the incredible ability that corporate capitalism has to co-opt anything, right? Including information technologies, social media, all the rest of it. So, that I think we didn't adequately account for. But, I still think that there's grounds for hope. I think, this, and to me, this is one of the really interesting things about these new media and these information technologies, is that they can be used for such a wide variety of different purposes. So, yes, it's true. It can be used to make Jeff Bezos another gazillion dollars, and it is used for that, right? But at the same time, it can also be used to circulate radical post-anarchist memes or, anything else that you want. So,
yeah, I've actually, so a lot of people complain about Twitter as sort of this cesspool of, whatever reaction or just kind of bullshit, right? But I've had a fantastic experience with it. I've met an incredible amount of people. There's a guy I've been doing a series of episodes with. We're looking at Guattari's Machinic Unconscious, and this guy, he's like a barista at Starbucks, but he translated Machinic Unconscious into English. And he's just, is on Twitter, and we connected that way. And we've been doing.
And here's somebody who, without Twitter, you probably never would have talked to this guy, right? You never would have encountered him in a million years. Yeah,
absolutely. And he's extremely accessible and just an incredibly smart individual. And so, I mean, like you said, that's a connection that I totally never would have made. So definitely, there's still that ability to. It's kind of that Deleuzian reterritorialization, deterritorialization thing, which I think ultimately is moving towards, more deterritorialized forms. For whether that's good or bad, remains to be seen. But I think that kind of move still is in place.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been really impressed to see how network technologies can facilitate these interesting kinds of social interactions that I don't think would have been possible before. I teach a class on the history of computer networks. And one time a few years ago when I was teaching it, we were talking about Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. Right. And so one of my students, my best student that quarter, decided, well, I'm just going to write to Tim Berners-Lee and, ask him about it. Right. And Berners-Lee wrote back, right? And so I'm like, well, this is great. First of all, this is why Berners-Lee invented the web, was so that stuff like this could happen, right? Yeah. And it seems like he practices what he preaches. So that's cool.
It's been cool, an experience with the podcast, and just, I feel like I had read, I saw you mentioned on like Saul Newman's Wikipedia page. I was like, oh, I should, I'll just see, hey, what's worth a shot? I'll see if someone's willing to come on the podcast. And I've had a lot of success with that. I even, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I can get Franco Berardi to come talk about Guattari. I'm like, fingers crossed. But I randomly found his email on some it's so funny too. It was this random paper that he had published in 2010 that for some reason had his email address on it. And I was like, I don't even know if this is the same guy, but I'm going to give it a shot. Sure enough, a week later, he's like, hey, sorry for the whatever, but I'm available at this time. Let's talk. Throw me a date or something. So it's pretty wild.
And, I've been on the receiving end of some of those emails, and I'm always just delighted. I'm like, wow, somebody read that paper and actually remembered it. It's incredible.
But I guess to get back to, and this is a really fun article. I think if you enjoy comics, if you enjoy anarchism and theory. This is a really enjoyable read, the Invisibles discussion. So we talked about the Lacanian element of it, but another, and we talked a bit about this with Danny the Street, is how this fluidity of identity that is present throughout the book, or the series rather, the Invisibles itself. And maybe we should discuss and kind of maybe a couple of the characters to kind of explore that and how that sort of works, because there's a lot of interesting things going on there too in terms of gender and sexual identity and so forth that I think is pretty valuable and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think all of the main characters in the Invisibles express some interesting ideas about identity, and they all do so in kind of different ways. So there's King Mob. So he's the kind of provisional leader of the group at the beginning, although their leadership changes because they have this kind of flattened hierarchy where there isn't a single designated leader. And King Mob, well, he's a meme, right? Literally,
yeah, very
right?
true. Right?
So this goes back to the Gordon riots in the 18th century. It's one of the early prison riots, and King Mob was a graffiti that they would scrawl on the walls there. And then later in the 1960s, it became the name of a magazine for the Situationists. And then it became this comic book character, right? So, here's this guy who literally embodies the concept of the meme and doesn't really seem to have any kind of fixed identity beyond that. And then you've got Ragged Robin, whose character kind of embodies the masquerade, the idea that identity is performance, that it's about the makeup that you put on or the costume, or, well, in her case, the leather fetish gear that you put on.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then Lord Fanny, of course, who is the kind of transgender character. And, and in some ways, I think Lord Fanny is especially interesting. In the mythology of the comic, they have the idea that Lord Fanny was born as a boy or assigned a male gender at birth, but then had to become female in order to become a shaman, because that gender transition was seen as necessary in order for Fanny to become a practitioner of magic. And apparently this is something that Grant Morrison is also into, that he actually does, again, practice what he preaches.
Oh, yeah.
As I understand it, that he actually does regard magic as a serious kind of ontological force. And so, Lord Fanny, I think, is very interesting as a character that, sort of combines a very fluid gender identity, very interesting non-normative sexuality, and then this, this conception of magic as a different kind of semiotics, let's say, right? A different kind of language, a different vocabulary for expressing things.
The idea that the sigil magic stuff is really interesting in the context of semiotics, and something that I've found. So I'll have to send it to you. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's on YouTube. There's a really great talk that Morrison gives, and I can't remember how long ago it was, but he kind of talks about all this stuff about smoking hash and Kathmandu and like seeing aliens and all this stuff, and about how
and they put that into
sigils.
the comic, right? So then he has King Mob basically going through an almost identical experience, and so there's some points where the comic seems pretty autobiographical, or it seems like he's borrowed pretty directly from his own life to create some of those stories.
Yeah, I think he even called the Invisibles his a super sigil. So it was kind of his the whole project was this sort of magical enterprise.
Yep, yeah, the whole thing is one gigantic magic spell. So that's pretty cool.
And you mentioned, I can't remember, did you mention this already? The super context? No, you mentioned the drug, but not the super context. But I think this is an extremely fascinating concept, and really talk about the super context in the context of the Invisibles.
Okay, now let me get this in. I'm going to provide the context of the super context.
Right.
Okay, now I think I've got it. So the super context is, well, first of all, it's a narrative device because it's this. It's the ontology that the characters are approaching throughout the narrative of the series. But then it's also a really interesting way for thinking about the the three different Lacanian orders that we were talking about before. And so there's actually kind of an interesting debate about this. Some people see the super context as a return to the symbolic order, but I think you have to be careful there because I agree that it does involve a return to the symbolic, but it's a symbolic that's been purged of ego, right? So there's no subject-centered rationality. There's no kind of classic autonomous Cartesian self that doesn't exist within the super context.
Right.
So I see it as a kind of language or symbolism or semiotics that's been completely purged of individual subjectivity. And this is an idea that's been bouncing around kind of post-structuralist circles for a while. Even if you go back to the late 60s, Foucault had that wonderful essay, What is an Author? And at the end of that essay, he speculates about the possibility of a discourse that will circulate without authorship, right? And so, to me, that's kind of what the super context is we don't need authors, we don't need egos, we don't need this, kind of obsolete notion of the rational, autonomous individual, but we don't have to sacrifice language and communication for that, right? We can still have those things, just, take the ego out of it. So I think it's a pretty interesting idea.
What I thought was most interesting you point out from, and this is, again, heavy spoiler alert for the Invisibles, is the way that King Mob, right, defeats and I forget the main antagonist.
The Archon.
The Archon with the gun that has like so the gun kind of it's like a trope and of the kind of gag of you pull the trigger and out comes a flag that says pow or bang or whatever the case may be. But in the context of the comic, that's how the antagonist is defeated by King Mob by
with a signifier. Yeah, exactly. It's a little piece of language that does it. And so I think that Morrison uses the key drug for that, right? So they've given the bad guy the key drug. So then when he sees the signifier, right, the signifier of the noise that a gun would make, it's equivalent to an actual gun, right? So it actually destroys the monstrous villain. And there's all kinds of stuff like that throughout the comics. So yeah, it's got some really interesting ideas about how language can be used in a performative way, right? Not just as I think a lot of people in their day-to-day usage of language, I think of it as a way that we describe things or a way that we communicate with each other, which it also is, of course. But sometimes people, I think, don't pay enough attention to the performative aspect. They can actually do things with language, and that's something that the Invisibles, I think, really foregrounds.
Right, and it's that potential that I think is so fascinating, and what I guess ultimately that's like what I find really interesting in terms of study is, like I was mentioning with posting on Twitter or memes or what have you, like that the potentiality for that to take on a greater significance in terms of some type of praxis or some type of movement to collapse whatever the symbolic order that we've it's been established by capital.
When I think about it, what do you call it? The memosphere, right. the environment of memes. It sounds a lot like the super context, actually.
It really does.
Because, here are these signifiers, these pieces of information that circulate without authorship, right? You generally have no idea who the original creator of a meme was. If the meme has done its job, then it's just something that just pops from one computer to another, without regards to authorship. So it seems like there actually is this sort of implementation of that idea that you can have discourse that circulates without any kind of stable individual standing behind that discourse
or authority, right? A random person can make a meme that contains something that gets people thinking, like, and so that, I mean, what's interesting too is, I guess, this more grounded concept of what magic is and how it operates for people like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. It is sort of this, like, it's communication. That's what, like, sigil, symbol, like there's probably like a root word that connects those two ideas at some point, right?
Yeah, and I think this is one way in which Morrison and Moore are quite similar as comic book writers. I think they both understand what they're doing as performative. I think they're both, they're using words to make things happen, to actually generate change in the world, and I actually think they're both quite good at it.
Oh, absolutely.
And sometimes I think they even surprise themselves with how effective they are. So as I mentioned, I'm working on this new paper about Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, and so there was this really interesting moment after the film version of V for Vendetta came out in the early 2000s, which Moore hated without ever having seen it. But in any case, one of the effects of the film was to make that that Guy Fawkes mask incredibly popular. So now everybody wanted to have that, and so it started showing up at Occupy Wall Street, and they were using it in the Arab Spring, and then there was the anonymous hacker collective, and they took it on as their symbol. And so before you know it, this thing is just showing up all over the place. And Alan Moore actually went to one of the Occupy protests. I think it was Occupy St. Paul's Cathedral. And he says, it's kind of a trip when there's this thing that you think you just sort of made up and put into a comic book. And then the next thing you know, it's out there in the streets and it's reality. Right?
Yeah.
So, he actually sort of made that happen.
That's a sort of magic in the context of the way that they describe it, I think, which is super interesting.
I feel like both of those guys and some of the other more thoughtful comic book writers, when they write a book like V for Vendetta or like The Invisibles, I feel like they actually are casting a spell, right? Like they're actually doing some kind of a magical invocation and sort of inviting the audience to participate in the creation of that invocation.
So it's interesting to flip back to Doom Patrol. Early on, I think in the first trade paperback for Doom Patrol, there's a similar scenario where they defeat the antagonist with kind of a nonsense statement. There were, I feel like it was something like they had to like make up this irrational response to the thing, and that kind of unraveled, and that was the end of the antagonist. And I forget the details of it, but I always thought that was a really brilliant thing. And it kind of feels like Morrison kind of went and did something even more interesting with The Invisibles with that same sort of premise.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this strategy is I think that authors like this can they can kind of pinpoint some of the fissures, some of the fault lines in our semiotic system, the weak spots, and then they can find these points where a contradictory statement or a kind of logic puzzle can just sort of open up that fissure and reveal some of the broader gaps that exist within our structures of language and thought.
You mentioned a bit in the piece on The Invisibles of an ontological anarchy, which I think is very similar to kind of what Saul Newman discusses is this ontological element of anarchy. What would you say? What does an ontological anarchism look like?
This is one of the ways in which I think post-anarchism can move us beyond the more traditional type of anarchism. It used to be back in the 19th century or the early 20th century. There was at the time quite radical critique of capitalism and critique of state power, and those of course are still vitally important. But with post-anarchism, you have this idea that, well, in addition to challenging the state and challenging capital, we also need to challenge the dominant notion of reality, right? The dominant concept of what the real is, because those other things, those more traditional forms of political and economic power, they're supported by that conventional ontology, right? It's that sense of reality, that kind of conservative sense of reality, that's what enables these other oppressive systems. And so you really want to go to the heart of the matter, right? And find a way to, to critique that ontology that stands behind capitalism and state power. So I'm particularly interested in those forms of anarchist thinking that seem to be able to do that. I know I mentioned in the Invisibles paper the work of Hakim Bey. He came up with this really interesting idea of the the temporary autonomous zone. And
very timely, right?
Very timely. Yeah, I was just going to say,
perfectly.
it's another case where something that, this guy wrote about in an interesting book a couple of decades ago now shows up in the streets of Seattle, right? Where you literally have people creating these autonomous zones, right? And in a way that looks actually quite similar to what Hakim Bey had described. So, that's the kind of thing that I have in mind. What the situationists called psychogeography, finding a way to reconceptualize physical space, geographic space, architecture, finding a way to rethink an urban environment and turn it into something with a radically different meaning.
Right.
I mean, it's the same 4 blocks of downtown Seattle, but now it means something completely different, right? Because they've completely revised the signification of that territory.
And definitely something I recall from, I think you referenced this in the book, and I remember from Symbolic Death and Exchanges, Baudrillard saying, you can't defeat capitalism within the real itself. You can't fight. You're not going to win that battle on the ground of the real. This has to go into the, perhaps symbolically, there's an opportunity, or there's a fracture there that we can exploit. Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of interesting things in Baudrillard, but one of the ones that always fascinated me was the idea that, all of these power structures that seem so monolithic, that seem so absolute, that seem like we couldn't possibly challenge them, if you look at them very carefully, you realize that they actually don't have much reality. And so this is something that Baudrillard says, for example, about money, right? That money doesn't actually exist, that once upon a time it was gold, and then it was a piece of paper that claimed to represent gold, and now it's some numbers in a computer that claim to represent the piece of paper that claims to represent gold, right? So how is that real, right? There's no reality to that. And then it's the same kind of thing with political power, right? That it's all just smoke and mirrors. And I think that our current president is an excellent example of this, right? That, there's absolutely no substance to it. And so, if you pull aside that curtain, if you can actually manage to get people's attention long enough to say, hey, the emperor has no clothes, then suddenly you realize that, this is just ephemeral, right? That there actually is no significant reality to that political power that seems so overwhelming.
I had this idea, and I mean, this is not novel or anything like that, but I was in reading the Baudrillard chapter of the Postmodern Anarchism book. I had this, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is I've been obsessed really with this relationship between desire and capitalism and so forth. And obviously, Baudrillard discusses that so eloquently and does such a great job of exploring that element of the simulated elements of capitalism, whether it be money or power or what have you, the way that those things are operating. I had this idea that what markets do now is no longer are they regulating prices. What they're regulating is the flows of our desire itself. And I think you see that expressed in the way that people line up for, whether it be Christmas shopping or whether it be even more so is something like, I don't know if you're familiar with sneaker culture or things like that, where companies release it's this artificial scarcity of, we're going to release this limited number of this product, and then people line up for that. So it's like, that's the method of, markets are like a method of control and directing flows of desire for capital at this point, rather than like this maybe more antiquated notion, this real idea of regulating these goods or what have you, right?
I think there's a lot to that. So a couple of things. First of all, this idea of artificial scarcity, I think it's one of the sneakiest tricks that capitalism has at its disposal, and they've been using this for a long time. Look at the diamond industry. Diamonds are actually not naturally scarce, but you've got De Beers and a few other big companies that just make them scarce so that they can keep the prices up. And then, well, there's all kinds of examples. You mentioned sneakers. That's a good one. I used to be really into these collectible card games, Magic the Gathering, where, you've got some cards that are extra rare. And so, of course, those cost more. I think there's a lot of that. But I'm really intrigued by this idea that that the main function of markets now might be to regulate desire, or even to generate desire in some cases, right? To create desires that people didn't have before, or didn't realize that they had before. As I get more and more into Lacan, since I wrote Postmodern Anarchism, I've done more work on Lacan, and it just seems to me that desire is such a fundamental part of the human experience, and unfortunately, so easy to manipulate. And one of the ideas I take from Lacan is that desire is predicated on the notion that it cannot be fulfilled. Right? There's something fundamentally masochistic about it, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Desire, it's this void, right? You're never going to be able to satisfy it. It's always going to be there, no matter how much you have of whatever it is: sex, drugs, rock and roll, sneakers, Magic the Gathering, whatever it is, right?
How many comic books, right, are in your garage?
Yeah, well, so 10,000, and hey, I still want more, right? So, and I just feel like contemporary capitalism is so adept at taking advantage of that, right? And
Absolutely.
saying, okay, here's this bottomless pit of desire, and so we're just going to facilitate people, continuing to try to fill up that pit with the knowledge that, of course, they're never going to succeed.
My hot take is that, okay, so you hear that trope of capitalism is aligned with human nature. I think that it is, in wipe out the human nature reading of that, but what they really are getting at has some truth in it, in that desire is what they're describing whenever they mean human nature. Yep. And so I don't know, I always thought that was an interesting kind of like against the grain reading, but to apply Baudrillard to this too, in the context of the world we live in now with digital products, is now there's even now that we've escaped the real, and there's the virtual, there's an infinite tunnels of new, capitalism can keep finding new crevices. Yep. And just keep on going and proliferating different forms of desire. I mean, you see this with things like in-app purchases, or know what I mean? Like outfit skins and things for video game characters and all of that just endlessly.
Commodities that literally don't exist.
Exactly.
And so, I see people like playing one of these massively multiplayer online games, and they're buying a new outfit for their avatar, right? So they're buying and Baudrillard would love this, right? They're buying a non-existent set of clothing for their non-existent character that is in this game, right? But, spending, well, I was going to say real money. As I mentioned a moment ago, money's not real either, right? So they're spending fake money on fake clothes for their fake avatar. It's really bizarre. But, the other weird thing is that at the same time, this has led to what you might call a crisis of scarcity, because all of those quote unquote products, all of those things that are data, that are information, they're not scarce, right? Because you can reproduce digital data infinitely. And so once again, they have to create an artificial scarcity. And so, you get these ridiculous things like, well, here's one example. Okay, so I'm a history professor. We historians, we use the Chicago style of citation. And so whenever I'm teaching a research seminar, I assign my students to get a copy of this book, the Turabian book, that's got the citation style in it. It's from University of Chicago Press. Well, I used to have them buy a physical copy. I don't really feel comfortable doing that now in the age of COVID.
Right. And
so I asked my librarian, I said, could you try to buy a digital book of it, right? So that then they could just get it online. No, University of Chicago Press will not sell you a digital copy of that because it's too big of a cash cow for them.
Oh God.
So I'm like, let me get this straight. So they'll sell you a paper copy of the book, which is useless to students because the library's closed and they can't actually go and look at it, right? But they will not sell you a digital book that the students actually could use. So it's an artificial scarcity that they're trying to create here.
That's a great example. Oh man. In terms of the invisibles, we may have exhausted the bits that I wanted to go over. Let me just make sure. Okay. One interesting take here, and I think this goes back to Lacan, whom you mentioned, whom I think over the last couple of years I've just been obsessed with Lacan. All due
It
respect
happens to the best of us.
all due respect to Deleuze and Guattari, as I enjoy their thought, but to me, Lacan is the king. He's the king mob.
Yeah, he is. No, I totally agree with that. Yeah. Particularly when I was working on my most recent book, I was using a lot of Lacanian theory. So psychoanalytic media criticism is basically the theoretical model that I was using for that book. And it's kind of interesting because Lacan obviously was a psychoanalyst, and the people who thoroughly reject Lacan are professional psychologists and psychiatrists, right? Like they don't want to go anywhere near it. But once you get outside of those professions, right, you get outside of psychology and psychiatry, people love Lacan, right? Literary theorists, film critics, historians, philosophers, sociologists, right? Everybody else loves it. So I think that's kind of an interesting tension that, right. in what you might think of as Lacan's own field, he's a total pariah.
I know, right?
But like everybody else is totally into it.
I wonder too, and I actually guessed it myself on another podcast earlier this week about kind of why Freud should be sort of, maybe not, not entirely defended, but, people, you shouldn't dismiss Freud offhandedly. And I think maybe that there's an aspect of, because psychoanalysis was so much bigger, I think, in France and Europe than it ever became here. And I think there's probably, the American sort of empiricist, what's like the empiricist, or like, what is it? The Henry James, the kind of pragmatism, the American pragmatic element, and also the aggressive way that capitalism functions in this country. I think is sort of, that's the like dividing line that kind of kept psychoanalysis from really taking root here.
No, I think that's spot on. Psychoanalysis was always really a continental phenomenon. It's really the European continent that's where it thrived. And I think you've got a good analysis of why it did not really take off in the U.S. because in the United States, I think you're right. It's all about pragmatism. It's about practicality. It's about, well, not to put too fine a point on it, finding strategies of psychological treatment that will keep people in the capitalist labor market, right? And just keep them, functioning, working, consuming. They don't have to be happy, but, as long as they're functional workers and consumers, that's what American culture wants. And so naturally, they'll be drawn to things like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That has that much more pragmatic orientation. Yeah, so I think that's a good way to understand that pretty striking difference.
What is interesting too, so again, just via Twitter, I've met a handful of actual practicing analysts here in the States, and typically Lacan's theories not always that relevant for them. I mean, although they will sometimes take bits and pieces of Lacan's theory. It seems like the Freudian, or like the people that are influenced by Freud, like Whitehead and beyond, like some of that stuff is actually more utilized in the therapeutic practice. But that's been cool to kind of, because I've also had someone like, I don't know if you're familiar, I've had Todd McGowan on the show a couple of times, actually.
Oh, yeah. I cited him in my new book. Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool.
Yeah, he's doing some interesting work on Lacan and applying it to film theory. Yeah, it's good stuff. You were talking about this need to sort of defend Freud or defend psychoanalysis. What I see happening with Freud is something that's actually quite similar to what often happens with Marx, is that people find one idea from a thinker that they don't like, and they take that as grounds to reject the entire theory, right? So it's like, oh, Freud was wrong about penis envy, right? So therefore all of psychoanalysis is to be dismissed, right? Well, I agree with the first part. He was wrong about penis envy, but that doesn't mean you throw out the entire theory, right? So I just think it's interesting that there's some of these theories like psychoanalysis and like Marxism that seem susceptible to that, where we have this ridiculous expectation, right, that the theory has to be perfect. It has to be absolutely flawless, otherwise we just dismiss the whole thing.
Yeah, McGowan's pointed out, I think, very astutely too, that what one kind of very impressive thing about Freud is that he actually published several of the cases, discussed cases where he failed. Yep. Which you never see. Although, I was reading a Freud biography that was very unkind in many regards too. So.
Yeah.
Um,
And this is what I always tell my students when I'm encouraging them to take Freud seriously, is that, yeah, Freud frequently failed, but he failed in interesting ways.
right.
I think we can actually learn a lot from his failures. And I think he tried to learn from his failures, right? And when you're doing something like psychoanalysis, where your main object of study is the unconscious, which is something that, it's like the Lacanian real. It's inaccessible to us for the most part, right? So, you're bound to fail, right? It would not be reasonable to expect that that's going to be an unmitigated success, right? So accept your failure, learn from it, right? And build the theory. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable strategy.
So I think, at least for me, I think this is largely true of particularly America, is we have that sort of pragmatic or that rationalism so ingrained in us. But I think for me, it's what I think is so fascinating about psychoanalysis is I think for the longest time, I as well had that sort of, people are making rational decisions, or like all you have to do is, present someone with evidence of this and that, and they'll say, oh, okay, they'll reevaluate. But I think now you look at the world, and I don't see how you could possibly understand the world with any kind of logic.
Yeah.
without there being an unconscious, and, that depending on, define that however you like, I think that there must be something to it at some level.
Yeah, to me, this is the real revolutionary aspect of psychoanalysis, because, for centuries prior to Freud, it had been all about rationality, right? Reason was up on this pedestal ever since the Enlightenment, right? And I think our entire culture assumed this, right? That people are fundamentally rational, that they will make rational decisions as long as they have good information, right? That we can construct rational political and social and cultural systems, and then, maybe fix them as they go wrong,
Right.
but everything will basically be okay. And particularly in the United States right now, that is so obviously not true, right? So, I think I think we're likely to see a kind of renaissance in psychoanalysis, right? Because we desperately need a way to understand the irrational aspect of human thought and human behavior.
Right.
And psychoanalysis hopefully can give us this. I mean, I just saw, they're talking about like reopening the schools, and Trump's press secretary said, well, the science can't stand in the way of reopening the schools. And I'm like, what?
Oh yeah.
I don't even know where to start with that.
I know. Oh, I saw some post this morning on Twitter that I was just like, oh, it makes me want to go back to bed. Somebody was castigating, and relevant to this was like the teachers not wanting to, should strike or something like that. And this person was like, oh, do it then, or like, and someone else was commenting that the teachers were entitled and so forth. And I was just like, oh my God.
Yep.
I don't even know how to respond to that. It's so,
yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the term black pilling, but it's just like, oh.
Yeah, I get a lot of that. So I'm also the president of the faculty union at Cal Poly. So I'm neck deep in all of those conversations.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, bless your heart. But you mentioned, to tie this back to the article on the invisibles, you mentioned, via Lacan, the law as part of the symbolic order, and the invisibles being attacked from the imaginary. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that relationship? And I think you even said there's a little bit of overlap, or there's some disagreement in terms of how that role functions.
Sure. There's this debate about sort of where the characters in the invisibles fall, or where they operate, or how they function. And so I don't think you're likely to be able to kind of pigeonhole them into one of the three Lacanian orders, right? They go back and forth. They move between them. So I think it's more about the ways in which they occupy those three different orders. So I'd say that typically when they're confronting something like the law or government, or a fixed political institution, they tend to move into the imaginary as a way to challenge that, right? And then when they're when they're working with more potentially liberatory or emancipatory forms of language, then they might be moving more into the symbolic. And I think it's good to have that flexibility, right? That you don't want to just limit yourself in terms of your political tactics or your mode of communication. You need to have a variety of different options available to you. That's why in the new paper I'm working on about V for Vendetta, I'm talking about the concept of the floating signifier. A signifier that can have a very wide variety of different meanings. And the Guy Fawkes mask that we were talking about earlier is a good example of that, right? It's been appropriated by all these different political movements in a very wide variety of different contexts. So I think that kind of semiotic flexibility is very important for people who want to be able to have effective, meaningful political action in our present context.
You've seen too a similar phenomenon with the recent Joker film, the Joaquin Phoenix film that came out within the last year or so. A lot of people, people in Chile or Lebanon, or people like all across the globe are appropriating the symbol in a very similar fashion to the way that the Guy Fawkes masks were used. And I had this idea to take the Guy Fawkes mask and put the Joker makeup on the Guy Fawkes mask.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. No, that sounds like a great mashup. Absolutely.
Exactly. So like that, and that's an example of the kind of like, I don't know what it is, but I love that kind of, I don't know, there's something fun about that game, playing with those symbols that and that kind of same mechanism I think is present in memes or posting or whatever, whatever you have.
It's empowering. I really think it's empowering, right? Because, here you're basically asserting your power to take existing symbols and then recombine them into something that's new and different and unique and has a totally different meaning from what it originally had. And, that's a pretty amazing thing to be able to do, actually. So
it really
I think,
is.
it is.
There's like I said, there's an undeniable, I think, jouissance about that feel. I don't know. It's a positive, fun. I don't know. It's play. I don't know. That's something that I've always found enjoyable or cool about the post-structuralist and postmodernism is that ability to sort of play with signifiers and create something entirely new and pull things apart and reassemble them.
And I think it's crucial to maintain that playful attitude. There's so much in the world that's just awful, right? I mean, the world is on fire. We look around, there's race riots, there's COVID, there's, massive structural inequalities and structural racism. And it's like, that can be completely debilitating, right? If you're just coming at that with a more traditional kind of, serious activist perspective, you're going to get burned out.
Right.
You have to find some way to maintain some sense of playfulness in that, which is challenging, right? It's not easy to do that,
sure.
but I think it's crucial because otherwise, you just get exhausted.
I think, harnessing that libidinal element is one thing that maybe leftist movements haven't done in the past or that well. Yeah, obviously, I think the Situationists maybe were the best.
I was just thinking of them because they were pretty good at it. Yeah.
I think we could really use a new situationist type or a different approach, taking some elements of what they did and utilizing that as part of a more, overall revolutionary, I don't want to say necessary program, but approach or tactics, or I don't know. I think you can't ignore that element. Aesthetics are not everything, but they are important, right? Like your politics can't be all aesthetics, but you can't deny that aesthetics, the value of them or the potency that they can have.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of tricky to find that balance because we've seen cases where people try to develop a politics that is entirely aesthetics, and that's fascism,
right? Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So you have to watch out, obviously, for that.
Certainly.
But I don't think it's good to go the other way either, right? Where you have a politics that is completely divorced from aesthetics, because then how do you engage people? How do you actually build a movement based on that? You have to have something that appeals to people, not just on the rational level, but on this more kind of visceral level. So I think you need aesthetics for that.
I've said this a lot. You often see that dialectic as proposed by most kind of mainstream thinkers, is that capitalism is associated with abundance, and socialism or any kind of communist communal living is seen as lack.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they're thought of. So I think we need to you have to defeat that idea somehow.
Yep, absolutely.
And figure out how to integrate something libidinal and use desire for a revolutionary project of some type. Obviously, that's the question for us, right? But
yeah,
I think it's if your movement isn't taking that into account, or your approach isn't taking that into account, I think that you're definitely, it's a significant weakness in being able to defeat capitalism, because it is so, like we'd said, it's so slippery.
Yep.
And always able to re-territorialize anytime there's a little gap, it can fill that gap.
Absolutely.
So well.
And it's so clever at making these completely outrageous claims, and then making it difficult for people to challenge these claims. Like this idea that capitalism is supposedly associated with abundance.
Right.
And this goes back to Adam Smith, actually, right? He wrote about this in The Wealth of Nations, that if you have division of labor and you have each person, doing this little part of the economic production process, then it would supposedly add up to this great abundant wealth. Well, of course, what he didn't address, and what basically no liberal has addressed since then, at least to my satisfaction,
right,
is the distribution question, right? So, okay, there's an abundance of wealth, which is now, concentrated in the hands of this tiny, tiny elite. And then, everybody else is left scrambling around for the scraps. So, if that's your concept of abundance, okay, capitalism can achieve that kind of abundance, but no, thank you. That's not what I'm looking for. And then, it's hard to even have any kind of comprehensible conversation about socialism in this country. I look at the news. Apparently, Joe Biden is a socialist. So
right.
Who knew?
He's a hardcore Maoist. He's ready to lead.
Yeah, right.
Leading the long march from Delaware to San Francisco.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. And I'm a European historian, right? And so I study societies that actually have some kind of a left-wing tradition. And so, these people like Biden or even Obama, right, who in this country are labeled as socialists by the right, these would be considered, centrist candidates in Europe, or even center-right in some cases.
Absolutely.
Like Biden would be considered a center-right candidate.
It's pretty wild, that difference. My idea is just the isolation, the separation of the two oceans has really been that's kind of been a bulwark against the way that immigration is regulated as well. You just don't have the way Europe is, so everything's so close to one another. Travel is obviously everything's connected and so forth. That sort of frothing up of different ideas and approaches, plus the historical element too, right? I think that's one leg up the Europeans have, is a better, more grounded context of what history is and how it works, as opposed to this kind of totally symbolic or it's a simulated history that we have here that everyone buys into.
No, that's true. And so actually I was I've been recently discussing this controversy about the Confederate memorials, all the statues that are coming down and the Confederate flags that are being torn down and so forth. And, some of the people I was talking to said, well, but they're tearing down history. Trying to be patient. I said, well, no, it's not history, because there's zero context, right? There's a statue of some white guy who was probably a slave owner, and he's on his horse, and he's about to ride into battle to defend slavery, but there's no context for that, right? And there's a plaque that's got his name and the dates that he lived, right? And that's it, right? So that's not history, right? That's veneration of this, this random historical figure, and an implied veneration of all of the reprehensible values that guy held. So I don't see that as history, actually.
Right. History has been that's what history is thought of, is just like, history is names and dates and events that happen.
Yep.
And that's it. And obviously that behooves capitalism to remove any kind of context for anything or the way that history actually functions.
Yeah. I teach a course on historiography, and I usually start with that. I'm like, a lot of people who are not historians will tell you, oh yeah, history's really boring, right? Because it's all these names and dates and battles and places, and it's just a lot of boring facts that we have to memorize. And I say, if that's what history was, then I would agree with you 100%. Luckily, it's not, right? So it's about the analysis, the interpretation, developing discourses and arguments about the meaning of all those facts and dates and events and so forth. And so, yeah, on a good day, I can convey that, and then people can see that, yeah, that's actually the far more interesting part of historical study.
So I'll ask you a self-serving question here, since you did reference historiography. So I've had this idea for a book that I think is really good, and what my idea is here is what I want to do is put together a history of the post-structuralists, and in terms of more so the kind of the rivalries, the disagreements, the little interesting personal anecdotes that they have, because someone like Lacan has so many bizarre and hilarious stories, or like he's such a sort of domineering character in real life that I think is funny, but also like random stuff. Like I remember reading articles about how Badiou would send his Maoist students to disrupt Deleuze's lectures. And I think those little stuff like that is so interesting to me, and so funny and enjoyable to read about those like little personal experiences between them. So.
I would read that book. I mean, right? that sounds fascinating to me. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I remember when I was in graduate school and I was taking a course on theory, and we were talking about one of those endless arguments between Foucault and Derrida, and it was characterized as a domestic spat among Parisian intellectuals. I just thought, that sounds about right. And yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff, and it makes for a compelling narrative, right?
It really does.
I think it's. And I'm sure that those stories could also be used to shed light on their ideas as well, right? Because, generally when you have those kind of anecdotes and those tensions and debates and conflicts, there's, it usually relates in some fashion to the more philosophical kind of discourse that's going on at the same time. So, yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun.
There's some hilarious anecdotes about Lacan visiting Heidegger, and I forget it was like maybe they're driving in the car, and Lacan liked to drive fast, and so he's like hauling ass in his car, and like Heidegger's wife is like freaking out, and Heidegger's just kind of sitting there, and just stuff like that is so funny. And then there's another story with them, like Lacan is going, because he was a huge Heidegger fan actually, and Lacan is like going on and on all this theory, and Heidegger's just kind of sitting there. You can't tell if he was even listening or paying attention, according to the people in the room and stuff.
He's busy projecting himself concernfully towards death, right?
Exactly.
Heidegger, yeah.
But anyway, to get us back to, I guess, to wrap up the Invisibles kind of component of the discussion, we talked a little bit about the sexual in the Invisibles, which I think is definitely an interesting element of it, and I'm very forward thinking of Morrison to delve into that stuff, especially in the context of the early 1990s. I was curious if you had any exposure to his other book, The Filth, which I think gets even more, sexuality is even a far more a huge topic of or focus of that book.
I actually have not read that one, and it's kind of weird because I think I've read most of his other ones, but somehow never got around to The Filth. So, I'm going to make a note. I definitely need to check that one out.
It's very much, it could be, you know what I mean? It could have actually very well fit into the Invisibles. It's very much in that same Morrison style, quite a bit in terms of the way that the characters operate, and that kind of dualist, like how in the Invisibles they'll kind of slip into the other type of reality. I forget even what it's called off the top of my head, but it sort of has that same play, but it's, again, The Filth, so it's all this kind of grotesque sexual weirdness going on in typical Morrison fashion. So just kind of curious. There's even there's panels of the book where somehow these giant sperm are like the people are like the panel is people running to escape these giant spermatozoa that are kind of floating through the air.
Yeah, that sounds like Morrison.
The imagery is pretty wild. Yep. But to move us, we'll kind of spend the rest of the episode looking at the actual book, Postmodern Anarchism. You start off sort of describing Nietzsche's influence, and which you often, I mean, I've heard people say that or argue that Nietzsche is kind of the Marx for anarchists in a way, which I think is can be sort of, and you talk about this too, this sort of dualist or this kind of opposition within Nietzsche between this sort of anti-anarchist and anti-socialist stuff, but also like at least ontologically how much his project sort of influences anarchism.
Yeah, so this is what's so fascinating to me about a figure like Nietzsche is that on the one hand, you know, he completely rejects all forms of socialist thinking. You know, he denounces anarchism, Marxism. He often mixes up the two, right? He doesn't necessarily seem to be all that well informed about the, you know, real debates within radical politics that were contemporary with him. But on the basis of his limited knowledge, he completely rejects that entire radical tradition. And yet, his ideas seem to provide the basis for an interesting and, in my view, innovative way of rethinking anarchist political philosophy. So I guess I like a challenge. You know, I like to take somebody who stands up and says, you know, I hate anarchy, and then you use that person and use their philosophy as, you know, as the basis for some kind of anarchist thinking.
And talking with Saul, he was all kind of saying, well, because I'm a big fan of Stirner as well, and I don't know how much you're interested in him at all, but he was kind of like, you know, Stirner is doing a lot of the same things as Nietzsche, but without that kind of weird aristocratic patrician sensibility.
Yep.
So you can kind of like get a lot of the same things without all that extra baggage.
Yeah. That sounds right. Yeah, I like Stirner as well. And with Nietzsche, you know, a lot of it goes back to his background as a classical philologist, right? And so, you know, he spent so much time, you know, most of his early career studying the classical Greek and Roman cultures. And I feel like he internalized a lot of those, you know, kind of aristocratic values from the ancient world. Right. Yeah, well, and even wrote about it, right? Like in the first essay, The Genealogy of Morals. So, yeah, I think that's definitely something that's specific to Nietzsche. And then, yeah, you don't really get that kind of aristocratic focus so much in Stirner.
You might find this interesting. So I have recently talked to someone who's, again, a practicing analyst, and I get this, an egoist Hegelian.
Interesting.
Right? And I was like, wow, how does that exactly work?
Yeah.
But I think, you know, I don't know how much of a fan of Hegel you are. I think typically anarchists are not.
Yeah, not so much.
Even though I mean, I'm sort of interested just in general about philosophy and theory. What I think is particularly fascinating about Hegel, and even applies a bit to Stirner, is how much they sort of, or particularly Hegel, is a thinker that deals with consciousness. Mm-hmm. And a lot of his ideas do fit. There is like a psychoanalytic element to them. Mm-hmm. And even then further to Stirner as well, that sort of psychoanalytic egoism or something like that has some kind of value potentially from that different angle, other than just anarchism or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, you know, when you realize that, the phenomenology is all about, you know, spirit gaining consciousness of itself, right? It's this story of how, you know, spirit attains this self-consciousness. I mean, that does sound like a psychological phenomenon, and I think it also does pertain to ego, right? It's like that old joke about Hegel that, there's this world historical teleological process that goes throughout all of human history, and the ultimate culmination of that process is George Hegel, right? That's the destination of history, right? So yeah, it could be ego, maybe in the bad sense,
right? The Prussian state as the end all be all of German idealism.
Right.
Which I think I had heard he actually really thought that.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, how could you actually write that with a straight face? It's like, the perfect ethical idea is the early 19th century Prussian state. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
You kind of talked about how Nietzsche is sort of, there's maybe perhaps three strands that kind of, or pillars here for this kind of post-anarchism. The first being Nietzsche. We talked about sort of the baggage of him. You mentioned a name that you don't hear anymore that much, but you mentioned Richard Rorty's critique of Nietzsche, Foucault as well. Maybe acquaint us with Rorty a little bit and that critique, because I think, most of the thinkers that I enjoy looking at, and I think probably you would as well, with the exception, I don't know if Lacan really draws all that much from Nietzsche, but certainly Baudrillard does, Foucault does, Derrida to a lesser extent, and then obviously Deleuze in particular. He's extremely influential for those thinkers, which sort of are at the top of my mind when I'm thinking about theory these days and some type of anarchism.
For me, Rorty was the main representative of that philosophical trend we were talking about a few minutes ago, pragmatism, right? That uniquely American approach to philosophy, which focuses so much on outcomes and on in the hands of Rorty. I see pragmatism as being used, mainly to kind of shore up the theoretical foundations of the modern liberal state. And so he ended up being, one of the main sort of critical targets in the book. I tried not to make him a straw man because I did want to take his theories seriously, but
right.
That was it was basically the variety of postmodern thinking that I wanted to sort of position myself against in that book.
It's funny. So one of the early texts, I don't even remember. I don't know how I would find this book, but I randomly found this little survey book that had Rorty was included among, it was the survey of postmodern thinkers that included Rorty. And I even remember thinking, even some of his ideas weren't that bad. I mean, in comparison to what we see today among like where liberalism is now, even Rorty seems a bit, I won't say revolutionary, but he's feels a little bit more to the left of kind of like the standard current of liberalism as it exists now.
Definitely. Yeah.
Which is kind of
funny. They keep moving the goalposts.
Yeah. It's like, woo.
Yep.
In the context of the law and the state, according to Nietzsche, that you reference in the book, which I thought was extremely fascinating, was and something I hadn't even considered was this relationship between crime and punishment and sort of that correspondence, that equivalency, or that idea that there is those sort of things can be equivocated.
Yeah. And this is something that I found, especially in the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals. There's a really interesting discussion in there where Nietzsche's talking about crime and punishment as a chain of signification. And, he almost sounds like a post-structuralist, avant la lettre, as they say, right? Like before the fact, talking about how, somebody commits a crime and then there's a trial and they're convicted and they're punished and whatever. But it's really just this chain of symbols and signifiers. And there's no necessary connection between the original crime and the punishment. And I thought that was such an interesting idea with obviously strong anarchist implications, right? Because that really goes to the heart of the whole kind of judicial apparatus that we have in the modern world, where, it's based on this premise of rationality. We see humans as rational actors who are making, reasonable decisions. And so then we feel justified in providing these punishments to them for their actions. But once you start, viewing humans in a different way, for example, a Lacanian way, you realize, we're these, black voids of infinite desire who are, trying to find some way to fill up that void and, taking actions. We don't even understand why we're taking these actions. And so then, it starts to make punishment seem much more arbitrary.
What I thought was really fascinating here, and I think there's something here, is that same thing being applied to money and value, or you know what I mean? I think there's a greater logic of capitalism, or of even maybe just in rationalist modernity, of that concept of exchange and equivalency through money or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
that sort of base, whatever that idea is, ultimately like impacts both of those, whether it be economically or with crime and punishment.
Absolutely. And this is something else that's in the second essay of the genealogy. It's part of Nietzsche's reading of Christianity, the idea that that we have a debt to our ancestors. And he uses this kind of quasi-economic language to talk about it, right? And so then this is his understanding of the crucifixion, right? Is that, oh, the debt is paid off, right? That Jesus died supposedly for our sins. And so now, that debt has been paid off. But then you start thinking about it and wondering, wow, is it ever actually possible to pay off a debt like that? Or, is it more like our national debt that's kind of like this permanent debt of guilt or sin or what have you that actually never can be paid off? So I thought that was kind of an interesting way to think about the relationship between different generations and how there might be some sense of obligation to the past.
It's sort of this oppressive element of modernity too, to just kind of rely on this. Again, it's that rationalist scientific approach that, okay, there must be an equivalent. We can codify everything there. You can arrive at these equivalencies, whether it be with punishment or with money or whatever the case may be. I did an anti-work episode a few weeks ago, and that was kind of one of the big eye openers there. Things that you kind of, again, it's things that you automatically know or you've experienced, but you haven't really thought about that in depth, or you haven't really had the vocabulary to think about them in this way. Was, there's trying to equivocate, someone, let's say you cleaning your house, right? There's a difference between being hired to go clean someone's house and doing it yourself, right? Even though everything else could be objective, like the exact same house, totally different experience. So if you're not accounting for that subjectivity element of reality, then, what are you doing? You're never going to you can't do that. It's not going to work. It's going to be that authoritarian notion of objectivity that, as we've discussed, is kind of phantasmatic or whatever. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, this to me is the fatal flaw of utilitarianism, right? The utilitarians always said, oh, we can just measure everything. We can figure out how much pleasure or discomfort each thing will bring, and then, create our social policy accordingly. And so, if that were actually true, you should be able to say, oh, it causes me this much displeasure to have to clean my own house, and this other person is willing to do it for this sum of money. And so that's, you can create this equivalence, but there's no way for it to account for that subjective element, right? That just doesn't fit into that kind of,
right, that
what John Stuart Mill called the cold calculus of pain and pleasure. Yeah, right. There's just no way to account for that.
Strand 2 that you discuss in the book brings up Lacan, who again is our king mob here.
Yeah.
What I love about what you discuss in the book, and what you do, is you incorporate a bit of a feminist critique of not only Lacan, but just, I think, in general, which is refreshing, because some of the other post-anarchist thinkers that I've talked to and read have not really encountered or really looked into feminism and the role that it has to play, and the role that women and feminist identity and so forth has to play. So I had even actually, I can't remember which author it was, but I actually emailed after reading the chapter. I was like, hey, I should reach out to this person if they're a feminist Lacanian, just because I think you don't see a lot of feminist Lacanians, or aside from like Joan Kopchak or someone like that. So,
well, this is one of the things that's actually most fascinating to me about Lacan, is that on the one hand, much like Freud, he says some completely outrageous things about women, right? And there are aspects of his theory that could easily be read as profoundly reactionary or anti-feminist. And yet, on the other hand, he's generated this very substantial interest among feminists, right. Going all the way back to the 1970s. So, you've got people like Kristeva, a little bit later, Judith Butler, Elizabeth Gross. There's a number of pretty significant feminist theorists who've found things of value in Lacan. And I mean, there's this whole tradition of kind of feminist Lacanian film theory and film criticism You mentioned Todd McGowan earlier. He's working in this tradition. And so this is people like Laura Mulvey back in the 70s who did some really important work on the male gaze, exactly. And that's like a huge concept now, right? And people use that all the time. And that basically derives from a feminist rereading of Lacan. I've recently been doing some work on horror films, and especially the slasher film. And so the big book there is a great book with a wonderful title, Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. Nice. And she introduced the concept of the final girl, right? The woman character who gets to survive to the end of the film. And, again, it's this huge influential theory. Everybody talks about it all the time. And a great deal of that is based on this kind of radicalized feminist rereading of psychoanalysis. So, yeah, I think there's really a lot to it.
Are you familiar with Alenka Zupancic?
I don't think so.
She is, I believe she's kind of a contemporary of Zizek's.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And since you have an interest in this, you might be interested in her book. It's What is Sex? Because she's a Lacanian. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping I eventually do want to, at least if nothing else, at least read the book. But I'm hoping one day I can get her to come on the show and discuss the book. But I don't know, just off the top of my head, I thought you might find that to be an interesting read.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. And I used quite a bit of Zizek in my recent book. Yeah, I think he's a really interesting interpreter of Lacan.
So you mentioned, forgive me if I'm wrong here, but there's a bit of a discussion about how women are excluded from subjectivity, and I can't remember if that was in the context of Lacan specifically in terms of theory, or if that was just a broader statement that you had made.
So thinking back to what I may have
20 years ago.
Exactly. So this gets back to the influential but also quite controversial argument that Claude Lévi-Strauss made about the place that women supposedly occupy in the symbolic exchange, right? According to Lévi-Strauss, in the vast majority of traditional societies, such as tribal societies, women are basically treated as objects of exchange within the marital economy, right? That men create these kinship structures through the exchange of women. And then in the 1970s, the cultural anthropologist Gail Rubin produced what I see as a devastating critique of Lévi-Strauss in an essay called The Traffic in Women, where she basically articulated this, I think, very effective feminist critique of that theory. So Rubin sort of started that process, and then other critics have continued with that. I think we've now got to the point where we start to realize that one of the unconscious effects of a lot of those traditional kinship structures, which, by the way, still exist in the modern world, right? One of the effects of those structures is actually to exclude women from the position of subjectivity, right? To treat them as objects. And so even today, I know a lot of people don't use the traditional wedding ceremonies anymore, but a lot still do. Right. And so you have things like the father giving away the bride, right? So here's one patriarch who takes a woman who he sees as his property and gives her as a gift to another man who's aspiring to become a patriarch, right? And then he goes, so and once you start thinking about that, you realize, wow, this is a problem, right? So I'm very interested in kind of rethinking all of that stuff, marriage relations, kinship structures, family structures, and how, all of that in a certain sense depends upon excluding women from the subject position and treating them as objects. And so then raises the obvious question, what is to be done about this, if anything? Here I see some potential for what we were talking about earlier, where why not just exclude everybody from the position of subjectivity, right? If we just kind of remove that whole concept, so that then no one has the privilege of being the coherent, stable, rational subject. Well, I don't know if that's a perfect solution, but at least it might create more equality, right? So that then men would not have this, special subject position that they could claim as their own.
Is that related to Lacan's notion that, I guess, the law of the father?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely, because this is a crucial way in which these kinship structures are constructed. By the way, Levi-Strauss and Lacan were good friends, as you may know, and borrowed each other's ideas. And so, when Levi-Strauss was talking about how this kinship structure works, he made a big deal out of the thing that Lacan would call the law of the father, which is the prohibition against incest, right? And so that's basically what enables the entire system, according to Levi-Strauss, right? There's this rule which is fundamental and appears in almost every human culture. It's basically a rule of exogamy, right? That you have to find a sexual partner from outside of your immediate family. And the way that plays out in most kinship structures is, well, if you're a man, you have to go to a man who is from a different family than yours, and you have to ask him for one of his women, right? And then that becomes your wife, and so that's how you can create your own family. But yeah, it all depends upon that prohibition against incest. That's what drives the whole exogamous structure of it.
I do want to read. You have a really good quote about just backing up a bit. This is not exactly quite related to what you just discussed, but you have a good quote from the book that I thought you articulated that idea well about how women are sort of excluded. And I'll read that now. To be sure, women, as understood by Irigaray as commodities who speak, who take themselves to market, can be seen as deeply subversive of the capitalist commodity exchange system.
Mm-hmm. And so to me, and obviously I'm drawing upon Luce Irigaray's work here. To me, this is one of the subversive potentials that exists within this deeply sexist system of kinship relations. Is that if we follow this line of reasoning through to its conclusion, well, we can end up concluding that that women might be simultaneously objects and subjects, which could be a fairly powerful position, right? That that yes, they are even today often treated as objects of exchange, but they also speak on their own behalf, right? As Irigary says, they take themselves to market. So that's different from an inanimate commodity, right? That's someone who has the ability to participate in the system not only as an object but also as a subject simultaneously. And so I think that's a really interesting possibility. Weirdly enough, something that I did write about in the last chapter of my latest book when I was writing on Joss Whedon's version of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, because like so much of early modern theater, this was centrally concerned with these alliances and kinship structures and who's going to marry whom and how the families are going to intertwine and so forth. And everybody's favorite character is Beatrice, who was even at the time pretty powerful kind of feminist character for precisely this reason, because she acts within the kinship structure more as a man would act, right, and not as a woman would act. And in those cases where she's not allowed to act the way that a man would act, she actually makes that explicit. "Oh, that I were a man," she says. "I would eat his heart in the marketplace." And Joss Whedon says, this is the most important scene that Shakespeare ever wrote, right? Because here we have this woman who, would normally just be trapped in this kinship structure where all the power resides with men and, nothing is available to her, and she rejects that, right? She won't actually put up with that. And so she insists upon taking this kind of masculine power for herself.
I have a friend that has a really interesting approach to this sort of men and women, feminism, masculinity as sort of the way that masculinity is constructed as sort of like it's regulated. So it's more so a set of, okay, a man cannot do X behavior because that's unmanly, right?
Yep. Versus
women are a threat whenever they are approaching into that male territory of however men can behave as subjects, which I thought was a really kind of fascinating way to think about it that I hadn't really figured out. Okay, there's so much of these restrictions, the sort of tropes of don't cry or don't show emotion or all that sort of stuff that's prohibitive. There's an interesting germ there of ideas to explore.
Oh, it's just fascinating. So in recent years, I've become absolutely intrigued with the sociology of gender. So there's a pretty famous sociologist, R.W. Connell, transgender, originally male, now female. And she's done some incredible work on gender, how we define masculinity and femininity. And so Connell introduced this notion of hegemonic masculinity, right? So these are all the things that the dominant culture takes to be manly, right? Like, I don't know, like being into cars and sports and, all these kind of things. And I don't give a damn about sports. I never have, right? I'm not a good man in that sense. I'm not masculine in that way, right? And so to me, it was just so liberating to realize, all these things that when I was growing up, my culture said, this is what it is to be a man. That's only one version of masculinity, right? That's the dominant one. That's the one that has cultural capital, but it's not the only game in town, right? And so Connell talks about these other versions as well. There's a complicit masculinity that kind of plays along with the hegemonic one. There's a subordinate masculinity that's Connell associates that with gay men, right? Because their masculinity is subordinate to that of straight men in a heteronormative culture. And then there's these kind of transgressive or oppositional masculinities where you can actually, develop a coherent form of masculinity that counters the dominant form, that resists it. And I love that idea. And so this is something that that I've been thinking about a lot, both in terms of my own personal life and then also in my teaching. In addition to history, I teach women's and gender studies. That field used to be known as women's studies. And I'm very grateful that now it's women's and gender studies. Actually, it's gone further. Now it's women's, gender, and queer studies. Oh, nice. So it's even more inclusive. I think it's crucial to have gender there because then we can talk not only about, the experience of women, but also about masculinity and about the problems and how our culture constructs masculinity.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last 5 or 6 years myself, because I'm definitely grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas, right? So very much this traditional masculine ideal is kind of what I internalized for so much of my life, right? And sort of, that idea of weakness, like if you show any kind of weakness, then that's bad. You're not a man, and being threatened, like you having to push out and externalize weakness or attack the weakness that you see in others to reify that kind of your own masculinity.
And now we're seeing how toxic that is. It's like Trump won't wear a face mask, right? Because that might suggest that he's unmanly or that he's weak somehow, right? And so 140,000 Americans have to die, right? Because he thinks it would be unmanly for him to put on a mask, so this is the consequence of that kind of thinking.
Absolutely. And so I have a huge interest in fashion as well. And so as time has gone on, I've, kind of broken down those kind of preconceptions of, a man can't wear X article, right? Or whatever. And I love to move into a more androgynous or even like I have a skirt that I wear and I present pretty, I'm some relatively fit. I've got a huge beard and, a pretty traditionally masculine, at least presenting type of person. But I don't know, again, along the lines of that, of the meme or whatever, messing with the symbols of it, I really like to do that, and kind of that contrast between, I'm presenting as this very masculine person, but I'm wearing a skirt or something like that. And not to toot my own horn as some liberatory practice, or I really like to, if I can mess with somebody's perceptions of what masculinity is in that way, then I feel like that's at least, I don't know, there's some value at some level.
I think that's very worthwhile. I wouldn't sell that short at all. I think, especially when you're talking about gender, just because our conceptions of gender are just so deeply ingrained, and anything that you can do to push people to think outside the box in terms of gender, I think is very valuable. My wife, Michelle, the executive director for our local LGBTQ plus organization, and last year they had a body positive fashion show for the young folks in the group, and it was just wonderful. They had, some boys, girls, non-binary, some transgender folks, just people all across the gender spectrum. And they found it so empowering to be able to get up there on stage and to wear what you want to wear, right? What feels empowering to you, and be able to present your gender in a way that makes sense to you, and not have to accept, whatever society says your gender ought to be. I think that's really important.
It is very funny to me how, and for a while I did customer service for like a fashion adjacent kind of company, and the responses, there would be ads on social media, whether it be like Facebook or something, and it's like an outfit, and it's like a plaid shirt and some dark jeans and some boots or something that people are like, oh, that's gay, or that's effeminate, or that's something like that. And I would just be like, wow.
Yeah.
So people attach themselves to these notions like
Yep.
that so intimately. It's so bizarre to me, and just I get so frustrated with that.
I know
kind of thing.
they see a plaid flannel shirt and they think butch lesbian.
Right? Yeah, it was,
like right away.
I don't even know if they were thinking that. It was just like, I mean, this is like not the most. You know what I mean? This is not the most. This is not This is like what? This is like someone workwear. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It was so bizarre to me how people kind of hold those identities that are fed to us so tightly and consider them so to have so much purchase in the real.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, it's just, and so one thing I've realized in recent years is just my gender seems to be such a big deal to other people.
Right.
And I'm like, why is it that other people care so much about what my gender is, right, or about how I choose to express it? Even with the pronouns, what's interesting to me about the pronouns is pronouns are words that other people use for us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't use our own pronouns, right? When we're talking about ourselves, we say I, which is the same for regardless of your gender, right?
Right.
So it's the words that other people use, and people seem very invested in this. It's
they really do.
They really do. It's like, what makes you think that you have the right to decide what pronoun you're going to use for me?
Right.
Yeah.
You see this a lot on Twitter too, because oftentimes a lot of trans, or even people that are considered some allies to trans folks or whomever, will put their pronouns in their little Twitter kind of bio or whatever. So you often see whatever these reactionaries or more right-wing types are like, oh, pronouns in the bio. Oh, we know that what that means, or you know what I mean. That's kind of their thing to attack. There was one person that had commented. They were something like, something about, you can't use these made up pronouns, and I was kind of like, oh, buddy.
Made up, like, I don't know, like all language is made up.
Yeah, I thought that was just so fun. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah,
we've got a long road ahead.
I finally put them in my email signature. So
I did notice that.
Yeah, I've got it in there. And that was interesting because for a while I was saying, I wouldn't really need to do this, right? Because I'm a cisgender man.
True.
And then and my wife pointed out, no, actually, it's even more important for you to do it because you're a cisgender man, right? So you can kind of model this and so.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah, it's like, why should gay people be the only ones who have to come out of the closet, right? Why couldn't straight people come out of the closet about being straight, right? So it's just a way to kind of challenge those expectations.
You might find this interesting too, Lewis, is that it's really, I don't know what this speaks to. I think there's something about, maybe it's just the circles, it could be just the echo chamber that I'm in that just creates this, but it seems like there's so many people that I'm friends with or follow on Twitter in particular that are like, they're transgender and they're anarchists or they're Marxists or whatever the case may be, but so many of those folks are radicalized, and I think it's very cool and interesting, and I'm grateful that so many of them like embrace me as a cis man, that we're friends and we can interact, and there's no like animosity between us. I don't know. I think that's so cool, and I think that speaks to something about anarchism or the value within it, that the sort of oppression or what these folks experience is a more direct, I guess, way that this whole kind of forced identity, whether it be as a consumer or gender or whatever the case may be, like these external identities that come to control us more than function as some sort of like practical way of operating in the world, which I think a lot of people assume without realizing, all pronouns are made up, right?
Yep. I think there's a real connection there. I mean, at the most basic fundamental level, you can think of anarchism as a complete rejection of the idea that outside forces should be able to tell you what your identity has to be, right? That's like a fundamental bedrock anarchist concept. And so I can see how anybody who's transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming in any way would find that very appealing, right? And so I think there's it's not surprising if there's a lot of crossover between anarchist communities and transgender or gender nonconforming communities.
To jump back to the book, I believe the third strand that you reference in the book was Weber, who I think often gets, you don't hear about Weber that much these days. I think actually Andrew Koch did mention Weber a little bit, but I'm kind of curious why you decided to reference Weber as part of the post-anarchism book, because I don't think that's a connection that most people would.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember too.
Sorry,
and no, that's okay.
We'll have to get you that. If I get you the key drug, will you?
Yeah, then the signifier will collapse into the signified, and it will all become clear. So I think what I was trying to do there is to set up some kind of broad context for the Baudrillard discussion.
Gotcha.
And so I was going back to some of the early sociologists, people who originally started developing these theories of symbolic exchange and so on. So I think that's how Weber and Durkheim and those guys got in there.
Gotcha. That's so interesting because so one of the most influential classes that I ever took in my life was just a sociology, like 1301 course. That really it blew my mind. One of the most mind-blowing things, and again, you got to contextualize this. Me growing up on a cattle ranch in Central Texas, fundamentalist Christian home, right? So I get to my 1301 sociology class, and the professor, to this day I still remember, he was talking about how we always say that the Soviet Union had elections, right? But there was only one party. And so whenever he flipped that and said, okay, well, yeah, the U.S. has elections too, but there's only one party, the Capitalist Party. That that connection there, that blew my mind.
Yep.
And so I ended up dual majoring in English and sociology. So I think that's an interesting. Cool. Maybe that's sort of that intellectual milieu of sociology and all these other things. It's interesting to see how that coalesces and the commonalities. You definitely utilizing Weber and other thinkers as well that kind of work in this post-anarchist realm. I just think that's an interesting coincidence. Or
I like to be very interdisciplinary. I don't like to limit myself. So, I mean, we've been talking about psychoanalysis and now sociology, anthropology. I like to draw, pretty broadly on a variety of different disciplines. Keeps things interesting. And by the way, I grew up in southern New Mexico, about 40 miles from the Texas state line.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Not on a cattle ranch, but
not on a cattle ranch. All right. So kind of similar vibes. To wrap us up, Louis, I suppose we can finish up on Baudrillard. I guess maybe it's because I'm already predisposed to be a tremendous fan of Baudrillard, but I really, really enjoyed the chapter on Baudrillard significantly.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the takes that I thought was especially interesting here, that again is one that most people may not have upon first glance, is that 20 years ago you did write that Baudrillard was in a sense more anarchistic than Foucault.
Yep, I did. You're right. I went back and looked at the book, and yeah, you're right. I did say that. So it's just one of those embarrassing comments that comes back to haunt you decades later. But
I like it.
What was I thinking there?
I thought it was interesting.
So I guess, a couple of things. So, for one thing, Foucault has this kind of fraught relationship with politics and political organizing, right? Because he was always skeptical of public intellectuals of the Jean-Paul Sartre variety, right? And so, wanted to avoid that temptation of being the brilliant intellectual who stands up and proclaims, here's how we're going to solve the world's problems, right? And so, and I think he had very good reasons for that skepticism. And I'm not saying by any means that makes Foucault apolitical. I don't think it does. But, I felt like, Baudrillard was coming from a very different place, and actually was, I think, more willing to, maybe not get involved in political movements in the traditional sense, but develop a theory that would be of great potential value to those movements, if you see what I mean. So, so that's what I really took from Baudrillard, is this, really interesting theory about gift giving and symbolic exchange, which I thought could actually be of great use to a number of anarchist and other types of progressive movements.
Good stuff. Like I said, Foucault was instrumental, I think, in me embracing anarchism. Although that, I think, at the time that I was reading him initially, it was more so from like the liberal, like the anarchism has been more something that I've delved into over the last 4 or 5 years than, it was. I think it was more of like I said, kind of a liberal anarchism or what have you that I was initially sort of coming from. But I think that's matured a lot, and I think Foucault is definitely instrumental, but Baudrillard I just absolutely loved, and I think he's such a prophet of postmodernity. The day after the 2016 election, I was like, holy shit, Baudrillard was right.
Yep. Welcome to the hyper real.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everything's simulation. Everything's fake news, right? Nothing's real. Yeah, I know. It seems all too accurate now, doesn't it?
I like this point that you reference in the book, just about Baudrillard's idea that we haven't reached the end of history, but the non-existence of history.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, aphorism. I guess, yeah. So I guess it's kind of weird for me as a historian to be talking about the
Right.
non-existence of my own field of study, but I still think it's an interesting idea. So, obviously there are huge problems with that concept of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, all that, and that turned out to be nonsense, right? But this idea that history doesn't really exist in the same sense that money doesn't exist, that
Right.
political power doesn't exist, right? That it has a kind of reality, but as simulation, right? So that's how I think I would approach that. Is that, and this gets back to historiography, right? So, when we write history, when we do historiography, we are basically, creating these simulations of the past, as Baudrillard might say. And so I think it's useful to recognize, this simulation. It's not how the past really was, right? It's not how, I teach my students about Leopold von Ranke and the empiricist school of history. And, Ranke said, we have to tell the past wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually was, right? And so we talk about the problems with that approach. So, I think if you, instead of doing that, if you, take this more kind of Baudrillardian approach and say, okay, I'm just going to write an interesting simulacrum of the past, right, that might reveal to us something of what happened in the past, that I think is still potentially valuable. And I think it could be a kind of fun and provocative way to write history.
Sort of like the approach he takes in what the Gulf War did not take place, I believe, is the actual title.
Yep. The year 2000 already happened before the year 2000, right? And the Gulf War didn't take place. Yeah. Yeah, he had a few pieces like that, kind of late in his career.
This may be unfair, again, to put you on the spot with, but I'm kind of curious. You do reference Bataille a bit in terms of, I think, more so Bataille, I think, is someone that Baudrillard draws from significantly. And I think in particular the Accurshare, which I haven't read and I haven't delved much into Bataille. What value do you see for Bataille, or at least maybe go into a little bit about how Bataille influenced Baudrillard?
So that book, The Accursed Share, was just a breath of fresh air for me. And it actually gets back to what we were talking about earlier with scarcity. Yeah, because so he develops this, he calls it a theory of general economy, which is just radically different from kind of liberal economic theory in every possible way from start to finish. And so, whereas liberal economics starts out with the assumption of scarcity and then uses that as the justification for markets and all the rest of it, Bataille starts out with the assumption of great abundance. And so then his whole thing is, we have this great abundance of wealth, and so what we have to figure out is how to use all of that up. And so, to me, it was just a radically different take on economics. And so he gives a lot of examples of kind of like frivolous uses of wealth, things like sacrifice, right? Where you're just wasting all of these, as it might appear to a liberal, wasting all of these resources, but actually doing something pretty important within a system of symbolic exchange.
Right.
So I just thought it was such a unique and different way of thinking about an economy.
Definitely.
And since so much of Baudrillard's stuff is about symbolic exchange, and as you say, he does draw upon some of those ideas from Bataille.
Scarcity of information was a kind of a bullet point that I thought was kind of inspiring, and it actually literally got, I mentioned that earlier, how it started to make me think about how, and I sort of had the germ of this idea earlier about how markets are not regulating prices, they're regulating desire.
Mm-hmm.
I think because of this section in the book that I was kind of like, oh, and again, it's oftentimes these things that you kind of feel instinctually or in your gut or, however you want to articulate it. But when you get that, when you can see the vocabulary that kind of drives it home, you're like, it's that light bulb coming on.
Yep.
It's so interesting. And
I love that feeling.
Right. We talked about, another element here from the Baudrillard chapter that I thought was quite interesting. And again, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, is about how important humanism is to capitalism and this sort of consumer society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that humanist subject, that humanist concept of the person understood as a rational economic agent who's making choices within the marketplace, that's what drives the whole system, right? That figure is crucial to the whole system, both in terms of production on the labor side, but also in terms of consumption. So, people who are really serious about critiquing that system of modern corporate consumer capitalism, I think they're well advised to target that particular humanist conception, because if you can develop a critique of that and show, this concept, this humanist concept of the rational economic agent is a fiction, well, then that sort of undermines the whole theoretical foundation of that entire economic system.
Something else you mentioned, I'm going to read, actually, this is a direct quote. I thought this was, so we kind of have said that, no, I guess we did sort of point out the relationship between the potentiality for information technology, for example, to be sort of this liberating force, but also it can go the other way. It could be a line of flight, or it could be a line of control, to borrow from Deleuze and Guattari. But I thought this was a great line from the book, is the more these political social economic systems advance towards their own perfection, the more they deconstruct themselves. And I think this is a really interesting passage, because I feel like you can see this operating so clearly within our current world, that sort of tension between these two. But it feels like the more deterritorialized things are heading that way, even if they're continually getting recuperated or reterritorialized by capital. It's like there is maybe this move towards something more fragmented and less controlling and less authoritarian, or more novel. But again, things can break either way, but there is at least some kind of space, and it feels like we're on the precipice of a totally new paradigm, potentially, when it comes to civilization or society, or however you want to articulate it.
Yeah, I like systems that break themselves and then put themselves back together again. So yeah, I'm cautiously hopeful that we may be experiencing something like that now. I mean, it's pretty clear that the systems that we've been relying upon are no longer functioning in the ways that they were intended to do. So if these systems can be self-deconstructing and then can sort of resurrect themselves in more useful and more ethical forms, then I think that has to be a good thing.
Last question for you would be, and again, putting you on the spot, this is, do you have a point of view on accelerationism at all? Because I know you referenced, I can't remember if it was the book or the article that you referenced Sadie Plant. So I was just kind of curious if you had a point
so
of view
I don't have a lot to say about accelerationism. I mean, I guess I do agree with kind of the basic point that the pace of technological change has been accelerating dramatically in recent decades. I'm skeptical of the notion that we might be able to control that process. I think it's largely beyond human control. And I also think it's very difficult, or maybe even impossible, to predict how that process is going to develop in the future. So I feel like sometimes accelerationism, has this kind of implicit teleology where they're saying, oh, we're accelerating towards this particular thing, or, it's going in this particular direction. I don't think we really can know that. And one of the reasons I think we can't know it is precisely because it is accelerating so much, right? So I think that that leaves it really beyond our capacity to develop a sound understanding of it, when we're living in that moment. But in terms of the question, are things changing, and is the rate of change getting faster? Yes, absolutely.
So there's a number of kind of accelerationism broadly, and then there's a number of kind of subcategories or ways of implementing it, or I don't know, that might not even be the best way to describe it, but one of them is there is like a gender accelerationism is one of them. So I just mentioned that because I feel like you might find that an interesting thing to look at or respond to in your work, and something that, again, accelerationism is something that I kind of have a somewhat of an interest to, just because of the cyberpunk elements of it, the sort of potential decentralized aspects of it. But also I feel like there is something going on as far as, and maybe this isn't even really accelerationism itself, as just more a theory of capital and the way that it's evolved is, we talked earlier about the way that, there are transactions within apps or video games in the context of desire. But thinking about that from a point of view of exchange, and how like the way that sort of development has evolved, because you have maybe like the credit card came out in the 1970s somewhere. And then that is sort of that maybe an inflection point for that acceleration for these, because transactions can be made without cash. So even just physically in physical space, the exchange is speeding up, right? And then as that progresses, then you have the internet, and before we had mobile apps and so forth, buying things online, going on Amazon.com from your home computer. That's speeding up that process of transaction and exchange. And now that we have the mobile phone that enables, even because you're on the go and you can you don't have to wait till you get home, or you see that product, you buy it directly from your phone. And how that, because that is a material force of society or culture or what have you, that speed is doing something. It's having an impact on our cultural and our systems of, whether it be political economy or what have you. There's definitely like that. The speeding up of that has really even just kind of completely wiped out liberalism's ability to control it or to manage it, even at a most, at a very basic level.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. I feel like, if you just look at the kind of stumbling way in which modern liberal states try to regulate or even to comprehend the new technologies, right? It seems like they're always several steps behind each new technological development. So, to me that says, a lot of these political structures are themselves probably fairly outdated now, and maybe it made sense or was capable of dealing with the kinds of technologies that were developing in the 19th century or the early 20th century, but they seem to have lost control over these rapidly accelerating kind of postmodern information technologies that we have now, and it's hard to see them ever being able to regain that control.
Right. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at in terms of how that sort of reterritorialization process is progressing towards these more sort of fragmentary, less monolithic forms. But also I think it's interesting that, like I said, the tension that capitalism's own logic is placing on its ability to reproduce itself is such an interesting thing. I also, along these lines, I had been thinking about, Marx always talked about, eventually these contradictions within capitalism would create its own dissolution or rupture or what have you. But it almost seems like, at least up to this point, that those antagonisms within capitalism are just contributing to that same process of accelerating everything up, and it's actually making the insane conflicts and contrasts like propel it. It just goes faster and faster. Instead of weakening it, it kind of reifies it or strengthens it by these insane.
Clearly it hasn't worked out the way that Marx anticipated, but. Again, I think much like Freud, Marx is somebody who, even when he's wrong in interesting ways, because I think he was right to say, there are these fundamental contradictions built into the capitalist system of political economy. And although, these did not lead to, the disintegration of capitalism and the rise of communism in the form that Marx envisioned it, I think it has led to some pretty significant changes. And, the way I see it is that the contradictions make capitalism mutate into something new, right? And often something so radically different that, okay, we still call it capitalism, but it almost doesn't even make sense to use that same word, because this bears no resemblance to the kind of, 19th century industrial factory capitalism that that the world once knew, right? So, that I think is the main impact of these tensions within the economic structure is, not to destroy capitalism, but to make it change into something that is so different that maybe we need a new term and maybe even a new, theoretical apparatus to understand this strange new creature.
And especially like I had that idea of how it regulates and controls and shapes and creates desires. I think that has sort of outgrown, like you said, that sort of quaint notion of supply and demand that you know what I mean? You get into debates with people that when you critique capital, supply and demand. That's it.
Well,
economics
when you have a system that is capable of generating infinite demand, then it's hard to see that as purely the operation of disinterested market forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that brings us to a pretty good stopping point for the episode, Lewis. I do want to allow, aside from thanking you again for joining me on the show, if there's something you'd like to perhaps say to the audience, or maybe a point that we didn't go over that you feel is relevant, I definitely would just want to give you the opportunity to tell us about, when your next book is coming out, where we can perhaps find some of your work, and because I think it'd be interesting to both those who are listening to this for the sort of comic book discussion, but also the anarchism and post-structuralism. So those are sort of the three pillars. So
well, it's probably going to be a while until my next book comes out, because I haven't started writing it yet or even figured out what it's going to be. I did very recently come out with my latest book, Sexualities in the Works of Joss Whedon, which we talked about a little bit. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and mainly I would just like to say to the audience, thanks for listening. And, I hope it's been interesting for you. And I'd like to thank you, Cooper. This has been a lot of fun for me. And thanks for having me on the show.
Tremendous pleasure. I really enjoyed the discussion. It was very it's just talking like a couple of friends talking.
That's I like
fun.
That kind of informal approach.
That's kind of what I try to go for, largely without, I try to kind of make that balance between we want to have some structure, but not too much structure, so that things flow and we get value out of the conversation without, just going off on too many tangents. But once again, Dr. Lewis Call, thanks so much for joining me. This will be Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry.
The
Signing off.
very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.